My name is Byron Tao. I am a reporter and author, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 382 for June 24th, 2024. And as I am sure you have figured out, from the intro to this show, we're going to be talking with Byron Tao today, author of the book Means of Control. And I read the book last month or a month before, and it is really just mind-blowing. So we've done two authors in a row, and both of these books are really just amazing books that I highly recommend everybody read. But if you are still not convinced how important privacy is and how big of a problem all this data collection is, you really need to read this book. So we're going to talk about that today with Byron. Real quick, before we do, just a little news item. If you have a Windows PC, basically of any variety, make sure that you take last Tuesday's update from Microsoft, the quote-unquote Patch Tuesday monthly security updates. Make sure that you install those right away, because it's a pretty nasty bug, and it can be exploited pretty easily within Wi-Fi distance of your device. Not remotely, thankfully, like from around the planet, but nevertheless, it was pretty bad. So make sure you get your PCs updated. So let me just set up the interview real quick, and then we'll get right to it. What we're really talking about today has a lot to do with the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And this is true, of course, any place around the planet that values privacy. But in particular, in the U.S., we have this amendment. It's pretty short. I'll just want to read it for you real quick. This is the entirety of the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. That's it. That's the whole of it. And that seems maybe straightforward, but then, if you really want to get legal about it, you got to start thinking about, okay, what does reasonable mean? What constitutes a search? That particular question has caused all sorts of grief in the courts over various cases. Who are the people? And is it strictly citizens? Could it just be people who are in the U.S.? And I will mention, by the way, that once again, the word privacy exists nowhere. It's nowhere in the Constitution. The right to privacy is an inferred thing, and because it's inferred, it has led to lots of interpretations and murkiness around these kind of laws. So the point being that law enforcement in particular, before they collect information about somebody, they're supposed to get a warrant. They're supposed to have probable cause, supposed to go to a judge, get a warrant, and say, this is what I'm looking for, and this is where I'm looking for it. But in today's world, when we are generating digital exhaust everywhere we go, and not just online, but even in the real world, when we're carrying around devices that are spewing unique identifiers wirelessly to anybody nearby who might want to take note of those things. All of our credit card purchases are monitored, and then all that data is packaged up and sold to third parties who then repackage it and sell it to other third parties. And the U.S. government, law enforcement, intelligence agencies have found this to be a wealth of data that, because it's available for sale on the open market, they have basically reasoned that they can access all of this without having to go through the pesky process of getting a warrant. So that is the subject of the book and what we'll be talking about with Byron today. A couple quick lingo items before we get into the interview. We talk about geofencing. That is this notion of, if I could track the exact location of something, think GPS or something like that, then I could maybe gather data based on a particular bounded region of geography. So everything within 1 mile of this site, or, everything on these blocks within a city, or everybody who passes a certain point on a highway, that kind of thing. That's kind of geofencing. We also talked briefly about net flow, and that is network flow. That is watching internet traffic, literally packets of data flying around the internet, and doing analysis of how that data is flowing, maybe where it's going or where it's coming from, because you can see the from and to IP addresses, things like that. A lot of metadata. So when we're talking about monitoring net flow, it's looking at how data traverses the internet, for example. So we have a lot to get into today, and let's get right to our interview with Byron Tao. Byron Tao is a reporter at Notice, a nonprofit newsroom in Washington, D.C., and the author of Means of Control. And he's previously spent 9 years at the Wall Street Journal. Very glad to have you on the show today, Byron. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I just read your book, and it is absolutely fabulous, and it's quickly risen to the top of my list of books everybody has to read. So everybody listen, just go ahead and put it on your list right now and move it to the top, because this is a fantastic book. We're going to dig into some of that today, but we will not even come close to doing this justice, so you'll still need to read the book. But I want to give people an idea of some of the stuff that's in here, because it's really powerful, powerful stuff. I usually am kind of methodical about how I break topics down on interviews and things like this, but today I'd like to do things maybe a little bit differently. I think some of the most powerful aspects of the book are the real-life stories that show how privacy isn't just academic, and how the collection and processing, of all of our digital exhaust can have very real consequences. So I really want to set the stage for the audience before we kind of dig into the details. Can you maybe give us a couple examples, kind of set the stage for our discussion today?
Sure. So one of my favorite stories in the book is actually involving Catholic priest who was using the app Grindr, and he was seeking out partners on this app, which is an LGBTQ-themed app. And at some point, a Catholic publication went out and purchased a large amount of data about Grindr users. It wasn't that Grindr was actually out there making its users' data available for sale. This is just the consequence of the way the advertising system works. And the fact is that whenever you see a targeted ad on an app that has your GPS location, you're actually sharing your location with thousands of private parties. And so certain data brokers are in a position to collect that information and make it available for sale. So this Catholic publication went out there. They bought data on Grindr users and managed to start geofencing facilities that belong to the Catholic Church, and identified one particular Catholic official and published a story about him. And he was forced to resign from his church position and, was the subject of critical reporting. So, there's all these interesting questions that are outside the scope of this discussion about Catholic morality. But the fact of the matter is that this was an internet user who expected a certain level of privacy from the app he was using. And someone was able to figure out something very interesting about him that he didn't necessarily want public and publish it. And so there are real consequences to these technological systems and the amount of data and information that they leak, and the amount of data and information that's out there and available for sale on all of us.
Now, were they particularly looking for this person? Were they trying to find and catch priests or members of the associated with the church in general? What were they looking for when they found this guy? Yeah,
so from what I can tell, there was either a single activist or a group of activists who were out there, and they were convinced that many Catholic priests were in fact violating their vows. And they went out there to show, I think, I'm reading a little bit into motivations here, but I think they went out there to show this with data. And they found that there was data available out there on the commercial market that could show exactly what they thought, that there were Catholic officials that were using these dating or hookup apps, and that they could even, in some cases, trace that usage back to specific individuals. And I think it was also intended as a warning to other users of this app who were affiliated or worked for the Catholic Church, that this data is out there and we could potentially unmask or out you as well.
Did they buy it directly from Grindr? Did they buy it from third parties that got it from Grindr? Could you just walk up and say, I want your data and give me a credit card?
So this is the interesting question. I don't think anyone knows exactly where it came from, but Grindr doesn't go out and make its users' geolocation data available for sale. This was data that was probably leaching into what's called these advertising exchanges. These are computerized systems where people who want to buy advertising are plugged into them, and people who have open ad space, like publishers like Grindr, are also plugged into them. And these systems are designed to connect all the people that want to serve ads with all the people that have open ad space. The problem is that there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of entities sitting on these networks. And some of those are data brokers, or they're marketing companies with a data broker arm or a secondary business of reselling data. So probably what happened here is that Grindr wants to make money on its app. It had open ad space, and some company somewhere was collecting all of the bids on some ad network and was making it available for sale. We don't know precisely which company, but I have done reporting, and Grindr data labeled as such is available and out there, and it's all movement data based on Grindr users and their specific GPS locations at a specific time.
Okay, so that should set up the rest of these questions pretty well. The bottom line being that there's a lot of data being collected, and it's not just going for the advertising that you might think it would be going for. There's a lot of secondary uses for this and tertiary uses for this that can get quite disturbing, as we will see today. So, yeah, I often talk about this notion of the panopticon, with this Jeremy Bentham, this guy came up with this idea for a means of control of inmates, watched by guards, but they couldn't always know when they were being watched. But because they felt like they could be watched any time, they kind of self-regulated. And so, I try to make that analogy of that's the world we live in today. But the problem with that theory for government-style digital surveillance is I still don't think people understand the degree to which they're being watched. So it doesn't quite apply exactly the way I think I'm trying to say it does, because I don't think people really realize how much they're being watched. So what are some of the more maybe surprising ways that people leak data today? And what could, we see this, you've already seen one case, which is why I want to start there, but what else can this data reveal about us that we might not be thinking about?
Yeah, so I think people have the general sense that when they download an app or they sign up for a service, that service may be collecting information about them. They have some notion that whoever is providing that weather app or that game may know things about them. And, if the police or the government wants it, maybe they have to go get a search warrant. I'm here to tell you that that's not exactly how it works. The biggest tech companies like your Facebooks and your Googles and your Twitters and your Apples, they're not actually out there explicitly selling data on people. But all these systems that they've constructed to deliver targeted advertising, to, put cookies on your computer as you browse the web, all of those are vulnerable at some point to data collection by third parties. And there are thousands of third parties out there collecting that data. So people leak information all the time. Whenever you sign up for a loyalty program at the grocery store, whenever you tell the USPS that you'd like to change addresses, whenever your utility provider gets your address, all these companies collect data and they sell data. There's a pretty well-established ecosystem of tracking people's addresses and their names and a little bit of their consumer propensity. Then you layer on social media. There are all sorts of brokers out there that scrape social media sites, a lot of it for commercial reasons, because big brands want to know what people are saying about their products and about their reputations. But also governments are out there trying to do public safety and trying to figure out who committed crimes and trying to do military operations. All that social data is very useful, including things like who you're actually connected to, your social graph, not just the content that you put on social media. So all that can be collected and mapped out. Then you talk about mobile phones and computers to some extent, if they have a GPS chip or their IP address is revealing location. All of that generates logs or data. When you load up a mobile advertisement, when you connect to the cell tower system, all of that generates a log somewhere, and some of that is available for sale on the open market to companies that want to do advertising and analytics. But of course, governments are there as well because they, again, have a public safety, national security, intelligence, or military mission, and the data is useful for that as well. Finally, now there's all these weird esoteric data sets that are kind of the frontier of data collection. And I'm thinking about things that emit wireless signals. So I've got an Apple Watch on my wrist. I've got an Oura Ring. I've got Bluetooth headphones in my pocket. There's a cloud of radio frequency energy emitting from me that is trackable if you put the right antenna up. And even things like car tires. Most people don't think about this, but your car tire has a little wireless sensor in it. And that's how your car's central computer knows what the tire pressure is. That's not a hardwired sensor from your tire to the car. That's a wireless sensor. And that wireless sensor is just constantly pinging a unique identifier. So again, if you know someone's car tire identifier or the identifier of their Bluetooth headphones, and you have antennas in places, or you've turned phones into antennas, which is a thing that's possible, you can collect all this messy wireless information and start to try to make sense of it. It's true in almost all of these data sets, with the exception of the consumer information, which really does have names. But most of this data is what these companies say is quote unquote anonymized. And that's not entirely true, right? Because geolocation data is very difficult to anonymize, for example. I'm the only person that wakes up at my home in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and rides his bike along the National Mall to my startup's offices here in Georgetown, a few miles away. My geographical pattern is unique to me. And it's the same thing with all these other identifiers, right? My Bluetooth headphones, my Oura Ring, these identifiers don't change. And if you know what to look for, if you have a large enough data set, if you have enough antennas, you can start to figure out who people are, even in this messy data.
Well, yeah, so I want to bring up 2 points. When you think about location data, I think some people maybe have the notion of, yeah, at any one moment, somebody could figure out where I'm at. But it's not just where you are right now. It's everywhere you've been. And I've seen some of these data sets from some of these organizations mapped, because they're constantly taking your data. And so they plot every place you've been on a daily basis. You can even animate it and watch someone's progress throughout the city during a day. So it's just a matter of knowing where you are now. Like, that's probably Kerry, because he said his address. I know where he lives. That's probably him. It's another thing to say, I can see their commute patterns like you're talking about, and what they do on the weekends. They're going to church. They're picking up their kids from school. It's really, really powerful. It's creepy if you actually see it mapped out kind of data.
Yeah. And, there's lots of things that people do on a day-to-day basis or every once in a while that they don't necessarily want public, right? People may visit a psychiatrist's office. People may seek reproductive or abortion health care. People may go to a sex toy shop, whatever. There's all sorts of things that your geographical patterns could reveal about you over time that you may not want revealed. And even just a matter of simple privacy. I don't think most people would like someone following them around all the time, but that's essentially what these data sets are doing. They're generating a precise log of everywhere you go all the time that's historical, that's sold and traded and bought. And that data can be used to reveal things about you, who you're friends with, what you're interested in, where you work, where your children go to school, where your children play. All sorts of creepy data is out there and is available for anyone who knows where to look and has enough money, time, and resources to access it.
The other thing you talk about in the book is something called gray data, which I don't think is a term I'd heard before, but you mentioned like the tire pressure sensors, but also things like your Easy Pass. I don't think a lot of people think about that being a tracking mechanism. I think it was in the book where you said, or you knew somebody who traveled with their Easy Pass and had I think they put a sound sensor into it that went off every time it was queried. And they ran a certain route that had no tolls whatsoever, and yet it went off multiple times during that point. Somebody was reading their Easy Pass. And I think what people need to understand, you talk about IDs, like Bluetooth and a lot of these wireless things often have a unique ID. Your tire pressure sensors have a unique ID in it, so that when they're squawking and they're kind of talking out, hey, here's my information, like your car knows to listen to these 4 IDs for the 4 tires that are in your vehicle, for example. Or your phone knows that, yeah, those are the headset that Carrie uses, so I need to make sure I connect to those because that's the ID I'm listening for here. But anybody nearby with a wireless receiver of the correct type could be picking up those IDs. And so therefore they're like pseudonymous identifiers. They're not anonymous. They are associated with you. They just don't have your name associated with it, right?
That's right. So this term gray data actually comes out of a conversation I was having with an intelligence officer. And there's a term that intelligence officers use, which is called gray literature. And that's essentially stuff that isn't traditionally published. It's not a book that's published by a traditional trade publisher. It's something that's unclassified and is generally available to the public, but isn't distributed in a traditional manner. So think a government report, like the Mueller report would be gray literature, right? It's a government document. It's published on a government website, but it's not published through a traditional publisher. It's not a bookstore. It's not a library. So this term was useful to describe certain kinds of things that could reveal interesting information about countries, right? Like their economic data, things about their military industrial base. And sometimes intelligence agencies would spend resources trying to collect gray literature to try to learn about the world. And so, you could go to a trade show and pick up a brochure. That's gray literature. So we were talking about the evolution of data acquisition by governments, and I started mentioning the tire pressure sensors. And I was saying, I have a bunch of sources that are describing the fact that governments have realized that car tires are screaming an identifier, and if you put up the right antenna, you can get some information about it. And I said, is that really what is traditionally referred to as open source intelligence? That seems a little bit more like something spookier than that. And he said, well, it's something like gray literature. And I said, oh, like gray data. And we sort of kind of invented this term in that conversation. And yes, so I refer to gray data in the book as data that can be ambiently collected, that isn't traditionally sold necessarily by sort of a traditional data broker. It is something that is collectible and exists, but yeah, it's so your car tire pressures, your Bluetooth headphones, there are lots of weird internet logs that you generate, like DNS and NetFlow data that some parties are in a position to collect. All of that is gray data that is not traditionally brokered, but is nevertheless collectible, and governments have gotten very, very interested in it. It's, in fact, the frontier of a lot of these intelligence programs. And sure, if you drive around the highway and you know what to look for, you will see that there are these sensor panels that are clearly antennas posted in places where there is no toll. And if you ask governments about them, they'll say, well, we're doing traffic measurement or analytics or something like that. And that was the example in the book of this, I think it was a hacker who presented at DEF CON, I think or Black Hat, one of them. And he had rewired his Easy Pass to make a moo noise. That's what's happening every time his Easy Pass moves, is some government somewhere is reading the Easy Pass, or it doesn't even necessarily have to be a government, right? Anyone with the right antenna listening to the right frequencies can pick up this information. And it has tremendous tracking potential as well, in addition to whatever analytics or traffic management governments are using it for. It has public safety purposes.
Yeah, and I think I've read several stories about neighborhoods putting in license plate readers and other things like this because they want to know who's coming and going. And I think Ring doorbells. This is all kind of lent to this atmosphere of neighborhood watch scenarios where people kind of, I think, I get overly paranoid. But then oftentimes these systems are hooked up to third parties who run the centralized system for this, who can then sell it information out the back door too, and they do. So we talked a little bit about this with the location, but the other thing I think that's important for people to understand is that all this data isn't just revealing about what you're doing right now or even what you did today. Like computer storage being what it is so cheap today that we literally have the capability to store like everyone's data potentially forever. And one of my favorite creepy quotes, is from Cardinal Richelieu, who said, "If you give me 6 lines written by the hand of the most honest of men, I will find something in them with which to hang him." Which means, you could be a perfectly model citizen from today forward, even. Like after you hear this podcast, you could clean up your act. But like, have you ever done anything that could get you in trouble? Have you ever transgressed that it was recorded somewhere? Probably. And, and social norms and laws change all the time. I mean, we've seen that in our own lifetimes quite a bit, actually. So given this fact, how should that color our thoughts on privacy and data collection?
Yeah, it's a great question. First I'd start by saying that traditionally in the United States, we have protected people's privacy and their liberty by limiting the access that the government has into basically your business. That, the way we've constructed our Constitution to require warrants and to require probable cause before you can root around somebody's home or their car, that's designed to be a privacy protecting mechanism. But the problem is when you have data that's available for sale, when you have data that's available in the hands of third parties, well, now those third parties get to decide whether to turn over information about you to a government entity. You've lost this expectation of privacy that's core to protecting your rights and limiting the powers of government. Second, the thing is that we often see people in the limelight because they've said something obnoxious on social media, or for whatever reason, they've become the main character of the day on Twitter. And yes, these, mobs of people will tear through every statement they've ever made. Historically, I believe one wag called it offense archaeology, which is digging through people's entire history of posts and their entire lives to try to find something to further embarrass them when they're the center of public controversy. This is just how the internet is, unfortunately. And so I think we all have stuff that we don't necessarily want presented to the entire world. We all have moments where we're not at our best and where we wouldn't be proud to have that be the thing that the internet remembers us for forever. And, I think everyone needs to show a little bit more grace on the internet, but also take a little bit more responsibility for what they're putting out into the world and how they think about digital privacy in this day and age, because these things really can come back to bite you and, embarrass you in some way. And, it is something to think about that we all need to grapple with as we use digital services and as we post on the internet.
Well, and as my daughters are growing up in the internet age, I try to impress upon them, the internet's forever. Don't put anything out there that you wouldn't want coming back someday, because it could, not necessarily would, but it certainly could. But with all the data all the data exhaust we're putting off and all the breadcrumbs we're leaving, it's not just what we normally post. There's a lot of stuff that we don't know that we're doing that's also being saved forever. And that, I think, is really scary. So you've broached the Fourth Amendment a little bit. And I want to talk a little bit about how I think we're at least starting to get this understanding that a lot of this data is being collected on us to try to have behavioral-based, highly targeted advertising. And some people are okay with that, especially if it means they get quote-unquote free services. But what I think we're coming to understand, and what I hope my audience is understanding, is the mere existence of that data, especially in a marketplace where it could be bought and sold, means that it's not just going to be used for that. It could be used for many other things as well, including by authorities. So we're going to talk about that in this podcast, but I want to break down a little bit, because there's different levels of authorities, and they have different jurisdictions and different rules they've got to follow. And I think it's important that we understand that. So let's talk about that real quick. So, what are some of the jurisdictions and limitations for, and I kind of break them into three areas. I think of like intelligence agencies, CIA, NSA, things like that, GCHQ, if you're going outside the U.S., versus like federal law, which would be like the FBI here in the United States, and then local law enforcement, cops and sheriffs and things like that. They all have different jurisdictions, bailiwicks, and different rules they've got to follow. So help me break that down a little bit, like where the lines are not supposed to be crossing, and then at a higher level, what should we be thinking about how they're getting all this data on us skews the power balance between the citizenry and the people they're supposed to be protecting?
Yeah, I think your breakdown or your taxonomy is exactly right, that there are essentially sort of three groups of government agencies when you think about these agencies with public safety or national security missions. And of course, there are other arms of the government that do public health and transportation planning. I focus less on them because they have less ability to visit consequences on citizens, but they are an important part of government activity. So when you talk about the intelligence community and the military, these are organizations, at least in the United States and most Western democracies, that actually operate under a staggering amount of rules. So it's actually very difficult to do intelligence collection, even intelligence collection based on publicly available or commercially available information. There's still a lot of privacy protections. You can acquire it inside the government, but it can't be used sort of willy-nilly. Generally speaking, it's difficult to get it on Americans. If you're an American intelligence agency, it's possible in some cases, but in general, your aperture is supposed to be focused abroad. And so I would say that a lot of those programs that are run inside the intelligence community that take advantage of data for sale, my sense is they are legitimately and genuinely targeted abroad and at foreigners. Then you go to sort of the domestic security agencies at the federal level, and that's both the FBI, but also the Department of Homeland Security, which has a pretty large border security mission and does a lot of internal immigration enforcement and has something of a counterterrorism mission as well. So those agencies actually are focused a lot more on the population of the United States. And those are agencies that, they do operate with rules, but they are acquiring a lot more data about Americans. And so a lot of the programs I write about when it came to location data that was purchased from data brokers, that was a big program inside DHS to try to find people who were crossing the border unlawfully, or to try to find border tunnels where there weren't supposed to be ports of entry, or to identify people who skipped out on their immigration hearing and round them up. DHS used all sorts of data for those purposes and did so without court approval or a warrant. It also, both DHS and the FBI do take advantage of the social media monitoring tools that data brokers make available to them to, do public safety, to monitor riots, to look at foreign influence campaigns. There's all sorts of reasons these agencies are looking at social media, and often that's domestic social media. Finally, you come down to the level of the local police. And, I'm not bashing the local police by any means, but there are more than 10,000 individual law enforcement agencies in the United States. And those agencies are very, very different. Some of them operate in big cities and are well supervised by political entities, and others are quite independent and report to an elected sheriff or something like that. And they're less supervised. They're in a rural area, or they're in an area where there just isn't great oversight, or the department has historically not been well monitored either by its citizenry or by whatever local civilian authorities were in charge. And so there's a wide variety of ways in which the local police are using this kind of data as well. A lot of these tools that I write about in my book, a lot of the programs that and the capabilities and the vendors were first sprung up to cater to the military or the intelligence community, and then they eventually found their way down to the local police in pretty short order. And so the exact same location tracking tool that DHS was using to try to identify border tunnels, well, that came to the local police not so long afterwards. And again, the local police are simply subjected to less rigorous oversight. There are not very many rules established by courts about what they can and cannot do with this information. And until either there are new laws around privacy or law enforcement access to this data, or judges take the law in a different direction, we're stuck with the status quo where it's just not, there's nothing stopping local police departments from, tracking people warrantlessly using these kind of data sets, or putting up, sensors all over the place to vacuum up people's wireless identifiers. And these are agencies that operate with far less oversight and constraint than our three-letter intelligence agencies at the national level.
So obviously one of the central themes in the book, and something that I've been beating the drum on for a while now too, is how all the corporate data collection, again, ostensibly for marketing and analytics purposes, enables surveillance and intelligence gathering and reconnaissance by these authorities that we just talked about. And I want to look at it from both sides, because it almost seems like they kind of met in the middle. So I want to come at it from either end. And first, talking about the corporations doing this, when did the data brokers go from chasing advertising money to selling directly to law enforcement intelligence agencies? Because you had a couple stories in the book of companies that were kind of struggling to find their niche, gathering data for and trying to sell it to certain. I think some of them were even doing it for like ostensibly for humanitarian purposes, and that wasn't going so well. And then somebody got the bright idea, hey, this is the kind of data that law enforcement agencies might also be very interested in having, and ended up making more money that way. So I'm curious, when did you see that trend kick in? When did that start happening? And then also, how transparent are these companies about these practices, both with their investors and even with their own employees? Because in the book, you kind of made it sound like there were some that weren't even, the employees didn't even know what they were up to.
Yeah. So I think the broad relationship with data brokers, or between data brokers and government agencies, I think the big turning point was 9/11. There certainly probably were some contracts before 9/11, but because 9/11 changed the mission of government so much, historically, the intelligence community and the military, they were trying to figure out, what the Soviet Union was doing, what the government of Cuba was doing. They were less interested in specific individuals unless they worked for those governments. After 9/11, that mission changed dramatically, where the government had to sort out who within a very large civilian population might be a potential danger. And that civilian population could be in many countries. We saw the 9/11 hijackers come from the Middle East, but some of them also lived in Germany. Some of them lived in the United States. So this became a worldwide manhunt to try to identify people who intended to do harm, who were embedded in and indistinguishable from a larger population. And I think data brokers had lots of interesting information to governments, and that information was going to be potentially useful in doing things like looking for suspicious patterns. So there became all sorts of research efforts and all sorts of companies that had sprung up in the marketing world or in, some other who had collected data for some other purpose suddenly had data that was valuable to government entities. And yes, that phenomenon you described of, some companies who were potentially struggling in the commercial marketplace or who hadn't quite found, the killer app or the right product for market. Some of them quickly found that government was a lifeline because governments have a lot of money. They have a lot of research and development money to throw around. They have grant programs and incubators for young companies. And, just at the end of the day, it's sometimes difficult to do business with the government. You have to comply with all sorts of rules. But once you're in the club, once you have a product that they like, it's usually a pretty consistent and lucrative revenue stream. And so there were a number of companies who started out as one thing, whether they were trying to build kind of an events app or they were trying to build kind of a goofy app that would stop you from drinking too much. That's a real story in my book. That company became a government contractor. There was another company who was trying to build a gig working app to try to collect prices in the developing world for international humanitarian organizations and Wall Street investors who wanted sort of frontier price information in emerging markets. And they too found themselves being drawn into government work. And so I think the overarching theme here is the government's appetite for data is pretty bottomless, right? There are, like other organizations in the world, governments want to understand more about the world, and data is a way to do that. And, their uses are slightly different from the commercial entities that some of these brokers are traditionally used to dealing with. But at the end of the day, to many of these data companies, the government is just another buyer, and they don't necessarily consider the social consequences or the difference between selling to, a big box store like Home Depot or Walmart and selling to a federal agency. To them, it's just a line on a sales sheet at the end of the quarter.
But I think there was at least one of the companies you talked about there where it's like the CEO or the maybe the C-suite was aware of this, and they were selling it out the back door to intelligence agencies, but I don't think their employees were even aware of that. And I can't. I'm getting this mixed up now.
I know exactly what you're talking about. That was a company called Premise Data. It had formed as a data for good startup that was collecting, as I was saying, the pricing data. That was that company. And in many, they didn't quite fully explain to many of their employees that they were going to pivot to much more defense and intelligence work. And a lot of the young idealistic employees who had joined what they thought was a data for good startup suddenly found themselves working for a defense contractor, and it led to a pretty severe culture clash and a lot of, recriminations, and there were even lawsuits that stemmed from this over employees being dissatisfied about the direction of the company. And that's, something that happens in these spaces where companies suddenly pivot and don't necessarily tell their employees exactly what they're pivoting to or what the data will be used for. And when it comes to light, it becomes a matter of some controversy.
As well it should. Okay, but on the flip side of this, the intelligence agencies and some of these other authorities, I think it's also at some point figured out this data is all swimming out there anyway. We can directly participate in this because you talked about real-time bidding and how you can pretend to be an advertiser as well as being an advertiser to get all this data. And so the agencies decided, like, well, we could actually just directly get this ourselves, and we could directly participate in some of these markets to tap into this data ourselves, and not just on foreign adversaries, but on citizens as well, despite the Fourth Amendment protection. So how is that legally justified? And in fact, they even called it ad-int, which I thought was great. Like there's OSINT and there's HUMINT and all these intelligence sources. This is ad-int. What were some of the legal justifications that where these agencies felt that they could actually go and get this data themselves without even bothering to go through a third-party middleman? How do they justify that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think generally speaking, these lawyers who have signed off on these programs, at least historically, have made the claim that this is, quote, anonymized data, which, as we've talked about, isn't really true when you're talking about geolocation data. It's very, very hard to anonymize your location patterns. Back to the example of me riding my bike down the mall from my home to here. I'm the only person that does that in the Washington area. So it's not really anonymized, but that was a claim that lawyers were making. And then more broadly, the idea was that people had consented to this, that in the terms of service of whatever app you've put on your phone that's serving you ads, you've essentially agreed to share your location with anyone who knows how to listen to it. And, if citizens have opted into this system to get targeted advertising from, Home Depot or Walmart about patio furniture, then whatever mission that the government has is much more important than that, right? They're trying to stop terrorists or, solve crimes or deport unlawful immigrants, whatever they're up to. They see their mission as more important than targeted advertising, and they see these systems being used by America's largest companies and say, well, we should have access to these systems too. One person in my book called the advertising system the largest information gathering ecosystem ever created. And he went on to note that it wasn't created by a government agency. Like these were systems created by corporations. And to government lawyers and to the frontline analysts and intelligence officers, their mission is so much more important than whatever Walmart is doing with this data.
So, all right, I want to get a little wonky. I want to get in the weeds just a little bit and talk about some of the actual named legal justifications of some things. There was 9/11 that caused the Patriot Act, for example. There's this thing called Executive Order 12333. You actually broadly mentioned the third-party doctrine, which was actually a legal doctrine. It wasn't just you gave it to a third party, therefore you must not care about it. That was actually a legal precedent, right? And then just recently, with the reauthorization of Section 702 from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, they even broadened the data collection in that, right?
Yeah. So in general, over the past 30 or so years, the trends have been towards authorizing more and more government data collection, at least on paper. Now, all these agencies pinky swear that they have all these internal rules that minimize the data on Americans, and that by and large, even if they're acquiring global data sets, they're really only looking abroad. But that's just, we have to sort of take their word for it. There's not necessarily a legal consequence or any sort of law that would limit their power to do that. Now, there has been some pushback over the years. We saw a bipartisan group of lawmakers introduce something called the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act, which would essentially ban the government from purchasing data on American citizens and using it in intelligence or law enforcement. And that actually passed the House a few months ago. And we have seen, civil society push back on some of this stuff. We saw an effort in the 702 renewal a few months ago to put sharper limits on government access to data or to stop the government from querying certain data sets. Which did fail, yes. But, in general, Congress, which historically had actually been quite good at balancing the need to access data with the need to provide people with a certain level of privacy, over the past 30 or so years in the internet era, it has essentially stopped legislating on these questions and instead largely deferred to both corporations who want to collect data for their own purposes and to intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies who claim that this sort of data helps stop crime or helps secure our nation. And so we remain the only industrialized democratic country now without any sort of a comprehensive national privacy framework. And there isn't one in sight, at least in the immediate future.
Well, I think to me, one of the most telling aspects to this, and you talk about this in the book as well, is despite having these legal justifications, and when you press them on this, they say the things that you say they say about what authorizes them to do this. But nevertheless, they actually often go to great lengths to hide these exact activities, and probably understanding that the general public, wouldn't like it. So, what are some of the lengths that these organizations have gone to try to avoid scrutiny by the general public and even, I think, congressional oversight?
Yeah, so a lot of the time they hide these programs under contractors, which makes it more difficult to get a sense of what the government is doing because all they're doing is buying what they call a solution from a contractor, or they're buying a tool, a license. And so you have less visibility into exactly what the government is doing because it's a private party that's providing the service or that's providing the tool. So that's one way. The second way is simply not talking about it. In doing this reporting, I contacted almost every major federal government agency and a lot of state ones, and I got zero cooperation whatsoever. I filled out a nice long, 5-page application for, support from the Department of Defense and assistance in writing a book, which they made me do. And then it went right in the circular file, or at the very least, they never got back to me, despite me following up dozens of times to hear from their privacy officers and their contracting officers and their leadership about how they're working with this data and what safeguards they put on it. So, and the same thing was true of almost every government agency I wrote about. I had to rely on former officials, sometimes the occasional person who is currently inside. I had to rely on FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and a lot of contracting records. I had to rely on employees of the outside contractors to tell this story because to the government, this is a useful capability. It's not necessarily classified. Most of what I write about in this book is technically unclassified. But to them, if the public knew how much data they were acquiring, if adversaries knew what exactly governments were doing with all this commercial data that was sloshing around, that they would change their behavior. And that even some corporations might find it uncomfortable to be selling this kind of data to the government. And, you also had companies that I would report on. There's one company in particular, Gravy Analytics. It's a marketing firm in the DC area. It started up and started collecting and aggregating a lot of location data. Well, At one point, they decided to start a federal contracting business. And, instead of doing that business under their traditional brand name, they set up this whole other subsidiary with a whole different trademark, and there was no outward links to them because to some extent they must know, that this is somewhat sensitive and that it wouldn't do their consumer-facing brand much good if they were known to be contracting directly with the Department of Homeland Security.
Well, there's even some more creepy versions of that. And for example, national security letters where they can actually require or demand assistance from some of these companies and then say, oh, and you can't tell anybody. But even worse than that, I think, so national security letters, they supposedly are doing that because it's, highly classified or we can't let this get out. Okay. But in so many other cases, like with stingrays and some of these other technologies that they've used to gather data, they went to great lengths to make sure that when cases were brought up when cases were brought up as the result of information that was found from these techniques, that they said, you can't actually use this in trial because we don't want anybody to know that we're doing this, right? I mean, they've actually made sure, they said, in fact, in some cases, they said, if the only way you can bring this to trial is to expose this data collection we're doing, then just skip it.
Yeah, a lot of these vendors put provisions in their contracts that the tool's output, the data that it generates, can never be introduced in a court proceeding. And I think the Harris Company, which manufactures the Stingray, and other tech companies that manufacture similar devices have put that in a lot of their contracts with police departments. And that also happened with location data companies. That there was one company called Babel Street, which said simply, you cannot introduce any of our material into court proceedings. Well, the problem with that is then the defendant is deprived of their right to challenge the technique. Right. And in some cases, many of these defendants never knew that they were subject to this kind of surveillance. So judges aren't even getting to weigh in on these sort of thorny privacy, civil liberties questions, even if they might ultimately come down on the side of these vendors and this kind of data collection. They're not even getting a chance to weigh in on this because defendants simply aren't being told that these tools and these techniques and these technologies are being used. And this is a pattern I've seen time and time again in reporting on this world, especially when these technologies move into the realm of law enforcement, that these vendors simply do not want the technology discussed, and the police are only happy to oblige because, as I was saying, people would change their behavior or they would, ditch their technology if they knew exactly how much surveillance they were subject to at any given moment.
Right. Yeah, and you hear stories about what they call parallel construction, where they try to come up with other ways that we would have gotten this data other than the way we actually got this data, because they don't want the techniques and procedures to come into the courtroom, because then there's also discovery, right? That means the defense can actually get a lot more information legally about those things that they don't want to give up. So yeah, it's just crazy and shady. And we're talking a lot about the United States here, but everything that we're talked about today from the perspective of the United States can be done by other foreign governments as well, both friendly and not so friendly, right?
That's exactly right.
So do we have arrangements with other governments to say, well, we can't collect this on our citizens, but you can, and then get it that way? And then second, China, Russia, all the other bad guys that we talk about have got to be doing all this stuff too, right?
Yeah. So everything I report on in this book is broadly applicable to other governments as well. I focus on the United States in part because we are a free and open society, and it's easier to report on free and open societies, but also we also hold ourselves to a higher standard, and we have rule of law and checks and balances and rights for defendants in a way that authoritarian countries don't profess to have and don't have. So I am a little tougher on our society than I am on authoritarian governments, though it should be said that authoritarian governments and governments around the world can easily access this kind of data. And in fact, there's clear evidence that they do. Israel, which is not an authoritarian government, but is a foreign government, has 3 tech vendors that sell access to ad data to governments around the world. And, sources have been very clear that they're positive that China and Russia are also accessing the same ad networks and the same data. And why wouldn't they, right? It's a system that's easily accessible to all these corporations. All you have to do is set up a marketing company with a plausible reason to be on one of these ad exchanges, and then you can start collecting essentially cybersecurity data from every device that ever sees a targeted ad, which is pretty much everybody. And so, it's reporting that applies more broadly and to countries all around the world. Any country with a halfway decent cyber intelligence program is almost certainly accessing this data or buying it in some way, shape, or form. To your other question about arrangements where governments use each other to do things that they might not be allowed to do under domestic law, it's a great question. People in civil society have long suspected this, and it's certainly true now that the U.S. and many other countries, including ones that we're not necessarily super close to, have some sort of intelligence sharing partnerships, whether that's sort of ad hoc or whether that's more formalized. And I think a lot of them were really solidified during the rise of ISIS and, the counterterrorism mission that involved dozens, if not more, countries around the world to fight back against the Islamic State. I don't really know. It certainly seems like it could happen, but the details of these arrangements are probably buried deep in the intelligence bureaucracy, and I never came across anything that would show that definitively.
I never thought about it. Did the notion of like Five Eyes and some of those other arrangements, did that come out of 9/11 or did that predate 9/11?
I believe the Five Eyes Alliance actually dates all the way back to World War II.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I think that was the sort of Allied intelligence sharing operation that just remained in effect after the war and has its since evolved into a formal and deep intelligence sharing partnership. But in theory, one of the provisions of that particular alliance is that we don't do exactly what you said, which is use the American Spy Agency to spy on British citizens and the like. If such arrangements did exist, they would probably be with non-Five Eyes partners just because of the way that particular treaty is worded.
We've talked about that a little bit, and there definitely is a political aspect to this, I think, too, and not just the technological aspects, but you covered some of the book as well. And you talked for instance, one of the programs that came out around that time was TIA, Total Information Awareness, and that got some blowback. Senator Ron Wyden was one of the people who pushed back against that. And then in your book, you talk about how it kind of just morphed and changed into something else. And then a little bit later, Snowden had his revelation. So maybe walk us through a little bit of some of the things that have kind of happened that we know of behind the scenes. How has the intelligence agency changed its techniques and things over the years as after 9/11, post 9/11, post Snowden, and then as the whole marketing thing ramped up with targeted advertising?
Yeah, it's funny because the public occasionally wakes up to these intelligence programs and questions and gets mad about it for a little bit. And then Congress does something, which is not usually super substantial, but they claim that they're doing something about it. And then the public goes right back to putting whatever apps they want on their phone. So the Total Information Awareness Program was really one of the first post 9/11 sort of defeats for the national security establishment. It was a research program funded by the Pentagon, run out of their DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency office, and it was headed by former Admiral John Poindexter, who had some involvement in the Iran-Contra affair. And so this was something of a second act for him, and he starts running this research program, and the aim of it was to take, the government's secret data and merge it with all this corporate data, because one of the revelations after 9/11 was that you could sort of tell the story of the 9/11 attacks through corporate information. There's this very interesting document the FBI put out after 9/11, which is a chronology of the attack. And if you read it, a lot of the chronology is simply corporate transactions, rental cars, leases, hotel rooms, airplane tickets,
flight lessons,
all of these corporate events, corporate data records helped inform the FBI's chronology of the attack. And so the question that the Total Information Awareness Program was grappling with was, could you take large volumes of corporate records from data brokers and hotels and airlines and start scanning for things like patterns that might indicate terrorist behavior? So just hypothetically imagine a person who rented a Penske truck and then also bought a lot of fertilizer and then also booked a series of hotel rooms between, Texas and Washington, D.C. and, then stopped paying their credit card bill. Well, each one of those things by themselves is not inherently suspicious, but all four of them put together might indicate a pattern that, might possibly be a terrorist attack. Now, it might not be. It might just be a farmer going on a road trip and starting up a farm in the Virginia area. I don't know. But it certainly could be something that you could scan for and potentially investigate. And so that was the basic idea. It was a bridge too far for many civil libertarians, even in the 18 months after 9/11. And after details of this research program became the center of, reporting in the New York Times and other publications, Congress essentially defunded it, at least on paper. So what really happened was, yes, they shut down the program and they actually did put a rider into the spending bill that said you can never deploy any of these technologies against American citizens. But a lot of the research, including the primary contractors and the other researchers that were working on the Total Information Awareness Program, merely shifted over to a different organization to continue what was essentially the same work in the shadows, in a classified setting. And many of those technologies, whether they came out of that research program, which was called basketball, or were simply incubated elsewhere, I mean, there's no monopoly on these ideas that they were grappling with, are reality today. And they were doing lots of uncontroversial stuff as well, right? They were looking at, speech-to-text translation, and they were looking at some problems of how to connect computer systems together into data analysis. And so almost all that research became a reality, whether it was through the continuation of the program in the intelligence community or merely it was research that was picked up by other people who had the same idea elsewhere. But, it's an interesting case study for the intelligence community because to them, this was a pretty useful program that the public had freaked out about. And, maybe the lesson for them was to be less vocal about what they're doing, that the public possibly couldn't handle these debates and that useful programs would be shut down if too many people talked out of school. And I think that's the ethos that has largely prevailed in the intelligence community, even around these unclassified research efforts in the years since.
All right. So as we wrap up, a couple of questions for you. I try not to get into conspiracy thinking too much, but I really sometimes wonder if the reason we don't have a general meaningful privacy law of which you spoke is not just due to lobbying by, the likes of Google and Facebook and data brokers, but also, maybe behind the scenes, intelligence agencies trying to protect this pretty rich source of information. In your reporting or in your investigating on this, did you pick up on anything like that? Have there been some of these attempts at a privacy law, do we know that they've been scuttled for reasons like this?
So I think it's fair to say that the specific proposal that Senator Wyden put forward called the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act, which also has Republican co-sponsors, I think there's been pretty credible reporting that the intelligence community was lobbying against that. And I think there have been some reports that the law enforcement organizations at the national level, like the National Sheriff's Association or the National Police Chiefs, there may be lobbying for carve-outs in a overall privacy law. I do think the calculation is changing a little bit on these questions of privacy. So, for example, yes, all this data acquisition is useful to the intelligence community for their mission, but it also makes it harder for them to operate when they want to do things abroad. So, It is a double-edged sword. And countries that we are collecting data on, well, now they have a way of collecting data on the American population. And so I do think some of the calculus is changing and that there is more of a focus from regulators and from the Biden administration and the Trump administration before them on these questions of data security. And I think you've seen, a lot of bipartisan concern and discussion over TikTok. I think you've seen a recent executive order from the administration that would essentially ban the transfer of data to countries of concern. And so, I don't know that there was an organized conspiracy, but I do know that the intelligence community and law enforcement has definitely been lobbying Congress to preserve access to some of these data sets. But I think part of it is simply inertia, that Congress struggles to do basic things in recent years and can't really decide on what a privacy framework should or would look like, and that could get bipartisan support and pass into law. I think that's something that they're going to struggle with for a long time until too many states pass too many conflicting provisions and there's enough pressure on them to do something about it.
So I got to ask the bottom line question here. What can we do about all this? If this bothers us, if we're worried about this, if we even just, want more transparency about things like this, what are, I guess, first of all, what are some concrete steps we could take to, kind of protect our privacy and reduce our digital breadcrumbs, if you think that's even possible today? I mean, as an investigative journalist, you must have worry about this because you could potentially give away sources, right? If you're tracked in this way. So do you have any practical advice, for us as consumers and then maybe more broadly as citizens of how we can, try to affect some change here?
Yeah, so I think you have probably a pretty sophisticated audience, so they're probably going to email me tips. But just broadly speaking, I do worry about this as a journalist. I mostly, at this point, worry about the content of my communications. So I do take great pains to communicate via Signal or WhatsApp or iMessage whenever possible. I do make it a point to store my notes in an end-to-end encrypted format. I try to do the basic cybersecurity hygiene things like patching things and keeping systems up to date. I am also quite careful with my permissions. I realize, I'm never going to get rid of all data exhaust, but I try not to give random apps access to my photo rolls or my calendar or my GPS location. And then broadly, philosophically, I think a lot of this world was built because people are so reticent and reluctant to pay money for services. I don't think there was a grand overarching conspiracy. I just think because of the way the internet evolved, because of the difficulty of taking payments on the early web in the 1990s, that people became quite accustomed to free and also quite resistant to paying. And I think if people don't like the world we've built, they should reconsider that a bit, that traditional capitalism involves paying money for a service and getting something in return, something of value. The internet economy sort of destroyed that bargain, and now people expect high quality things for free. Well, it's not free to make good quality products. Right. I think there's some examples of freeware or, volunteer-led projects that are quite good. So I'm not going to say it's impossible. But generally speaking, it costs money to develop things. It costs money to run the servers. It costs money to have lawyers and HR people to onboard your employees. And you have to pay those employees. And, nothing really is free. The cost is your data, and the cost is a world in which we're all trackable all the time. So if you don't like sort of how the internet has evolved, I think one of the things you can do is return us to a world in which we pay a little bit of money for the services that we derive benefit from and give developers a different set of incentives than to sell and monetize us as users.
And do you think, from a political perspective, it seems to me that there's almost like they even have a name for it, the techlash, right? There's this backlash against big tech on both sides of the aisle. Do you think that we could maybe parlay that current mood into pushing along some of this privacy regulation?
It's a good question. I do think, like any large industry, big tech should be rightfully subject to scrutiny and to criticism and to examine the social effects of the products that they build and sell to all of us. And I think for too long, they sort of floated along because they made cool things that were useful. But I do think there's increasing awareness of the costs and the business models potentially not being the greatest. And so I think that's an encouraging sign that people across the political spectrum are starting to, ask tough questions and wake up to this debate and start to have it as a society. I also think one of the other driving factors in a potential privacy framework for the entire United States is the fact that so many states have passed laws.
Yeah.
And when you have states passing laws that are sometimes contradictory, you eventually get an industry that actually cries out for regulation just because
Right.
they don't want to comply with 14 or 18 or 25 different state laws, some of which conflict with one another. So I think as more and more states pass these provisions or pass laws, and as more and more of them contradict each other or say different things, you will get a lot more pressure on Washington to just throw all of them out and write one set of rules. And that might be what finally gets a national privacy framework over the finish line.
Well, I hope so, because I think that would go a long way toward addressing a lot of what's going on here. So the book was fantastic. I was so glad you came on the show. I've learned a lot today, but you've got to read the book because there's so much more detail in this book. It's just fascinating and amazing and mind-blowing. So before we go, what are you working on next? Is there anything maybe in the book that you didn't get a chance to reveal that you're still working on? What's next for you?
Yeah, so currently I work at a nonprofit newsroom in Washington, D.C., where I cover politics and policy, including a lot of this national security stuff. And I am continuing to report on a lot of these interesting questions. I mean, I think the one thing I never fully fleshed out was the wireless surveillance. And I think I've been doing a lot of reporting on that. So governments are increasingly putting up wireless sensors everywhere and collecting the data from that and using just things like distributed networks of phones to do sort of mass surveillance of wireless devices. And that technology, again, is coming into local police departments. And I think that is the frontier of law, that the fact that we all carry around stuff in our pocket that emits signals and those signals are collectible, I think judges and courts are really going to have to grapple with what kind of privacy expectation you have and who is allowed to collect those things with just willy-nilly. So I continue to report on that, and I anticipate having some more stories in that vein.
Well, I look forward to it. Byron, this was a great interview and a fantastic book. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Big thanks to Byron for coming on the show. I'm so glad to have a chance to talk to him. That book was so good. So definitely put that on your list and put it somewhere near the top. It is a great read. If you've already drunk the privacy Kool-Aid, then if nothing else, that's a great book to hand to somebody else who may not be on the same page, because it's very, very compelling. A couple quick updates. The Fourth Amendment is not for sale act. As Byron mentioned, it was passed in the House. That was back in April. It is still sitting in the Senate, I believe. It has yet to be acted on in there. We can only hope. I was interested when you mentioned that thing about the DEF CON presentation where the hacker modified his Easy Pass toll thingy so that whenever it was queried, it mooed. It made a sound. I found it, actually. First of all, I found the presentation from DEF CON. It was on YouTube, so I put a link to that in the show notes. I haven't watched it yet myself, but I'm definitely going to be watching that. That looks very cool. And also, Hackaday, which is a great website, actually has a link to the schematics and the diagrams for how he modified that. I'm definitely going to have to look at that. I would very much like to consider trying that on my own Easy Pass to see what it tells me. And finally, I think maybe Byron mentioned this, or maybe I just ran across it in some of my research, but the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI, recently put out an official government policy about the collection of commercially available information. So if you really want to dig into the weeds and get wonky on that, I put a link to that in the show notes. For my patrons, there will be bonus content with the interview guest on Thursday, as usual. And stay tuned again for my book blitz. That's where I'm going to try to coordinate as many of you out there that may want to pick up a copy of my book for yourself or for others or both. Try to coordinate and get Ellis to buy them all kind of in one tight week or maybe 2 weeks or something like that. To try to do a little spike in book sales and hopefully get more noticed on Amazon. That will also involve, where possible, writing some reviews on Amazon. Those also make a really big difference. That may start as early as next week. I'm still trying to coordinate a couple things, which may push it back. So anyway, stay tuned. I will fire the starting pistol sometime in the next week or two. All right, so that will do it for this week, everybody. Thanks for listening. Take care out there. Stay safe. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.